extremely interesting and topical seminar. Before we start, I'd like to request our director, Professor Paul Kamau, to welcome all of you to IDS and to introduce the session.
Thank you. Thank you very much, the moderator for today's session, Dr. Radha Upadhyay. We are all excited to be here this afternoon. Allow me to very quickly welcome you all to IDS and University of Nairobi, and to say that we are very excited to have all of us in this call to discuss a very important element of credit rating. As I do not want to preempt the speakers and the discussants, as it were, just to highlight that the credit rating for many African countries has been declining, and therefore we need to know what goes into this credit rating, how is it done, who are authorized to do it, and what can African countries do, and especially Kenya, in order to improve the credit rating. So IDS is very excited to host this very unique seminar, just to help us understand some of these matters more critically. I know it was one of the topical issues last year when we had the African Development Bank meeting in Nairobi, and it was discussed in terms of how can Africa as a continent perhaps position itself for better credit rating. Having said that, is to say that IDS is open to host any of us researchers, students, to use this platform where we have a big database and participation of more than 200 people based in different parts of the globe who attend our seminar. So it's a good opportunity to disseminate research findings and also to get to interact with other like-minded researchers and scholars so that we can exchange knowledge. So we look forward to a very engaging session. I want to, in particular, recognize the presence of our presenter, discussant Mohammed, and Professor Winnie Mitula, who is also standing in for Wilu, who will be getting a chance to speak to us. But all of us, colleagues, students, researchers based at the university and other research institutes, I want to take this opportunity to welcome you all and say we are in safe hands. So we look forward to an interactive session. Over to you, Dr. Radha Upadhyay.
Thank you so much. Please, may I request Professor Mitula to introduce the program?
Thank you very much. And first of all, I think Professor Kamau, you didn't mention Peter Muriu. He's our colleague from the Department of Economics and Development Studies.
My apologies, Peter.
But go ahead, PK. Go ahead to welcome Peter. Then
that's an oversight, and I'm sure he's going to cane me badly when we meet
he
next.
will.
Professor Peter Muriu and I have a long history of working together from the time we were young. We did a lot of work in Kipra. But thank you very much, Professor Muriu, for agreeing to be our discussant this afternoon. And we are very excited given this area in finance and your speciality. I believe that we'll be hearing even more beyond the credit rating in terms of financial implication of this. So my apologies, Professor Muriu. I didn't see you on the platform, but I believe you're there. Feel most welcome to IDS. This is home for you because we are both based in the Institute and the Department of Economics and Development Studies. Thank you, Winnie, for that correction.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. And as has been stated by the director, Professor Kamau, IDS works in partnership, in collaboration, and we are always working with others as an Institute for Development Studies. Therefore, this particular seminar, it's a series. I think we are on our second or third. It is run by ULI Africa in collaboration with in collaboration with IDS. And the question is, what is ULI? Uli Africa. Uli is just a short form of kulingana, ulinganifu in Kiswahili, putting together, symmetry, harmony, you know. So the whole idea is it is a loose network upcoming, and what we're trying to promote is how do we encourage young scholars to continue contributing to knowledge and engaging with the public. So it crosses across young scholars, you know, networking, getting together, interrogating issues in Africa, and contributing to knowledge as we look to the future. So Uli Africa is about network, and it's an academic network. Scholars are based both in Africa, and some are Africans are working out there, and also those who are not Africans but are keen to discourse around issues you know, involving Africa and affecting Africa per se. So thank you. That is what the partnership means, and we've been very grateful as Uli. I double up, I'm also a member of the network, but I'm also a member of IDS, and we have really appreciated the hosting of Uli in terms of engagement by IDS. It's open to all young scholars and even senior scholars who are meant to mentor the young scholars. Thank you. Radha, back to you.
Thank you so much, Professor Mutula, for the introduction to Uli Africa and for helping, you know, to bring this really interesting speaker today. So I won't go into long introductions. I'll request the Basil to put the extended bios of the speakers and the discussants in the chat. But it's a great honor to welcome Dr. Theo Achimpong, who is an associate lecturer and honorary research fellow at the Department of Economics, University of Aberdeen, Scotland. And he's basically going to ask this thing like rating ourselves. What is the future of the Africa Credit Rating Agency? So Dr. Theo Achimpong, thank you very much for accepting and speaking to speakers at our students and other network at IDS. I give the floor to you. About 15 minutes. I'll tell you when you've done 15 minutes, maximum 20 minutes. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. I hope you can all see my screen as well, and it's a great opportunity to be here this morning, as we say in Kenya, Jambo, and I'd love to have done this physically, but the necessities of the time dictates this. Yeah, I'm quite happy to discuss this particular topic, not only from a research perspective, but I also work actively in the market. So in my other hat, I actually do consult for S&P, Standards & Poor's, which is one of the big three organizations within this space. However, just to disclose, I don't work for the ratings side of the business. So that's a Chinese war. I work for the market intelligence team side of the business. But I do talk to a lot of companies that are looking at, you know, financing treasuries or trying to move into markets in Africa, in different countries and jurisdictions. So I'm quite acquainted with these issues of credit ratings, both from an academic perspective. I've written extensively on that, but also from a sort of a more practical policy side of things. Just last week, I was in Ghana, where I come from, and I had a meeting with a new minister, and the question really was, okay, you know, how fast can we possibly, you know, go back to the international capital markets to raise some Eurobonds? What's the timing? What's the coupon rate? And all of those things. So it's a big topic. I prepared quite a number of slides. I'm not going to go through all of them just for the purposes of time, but just really sort of pick up on a few key points. One, you know, what is sovereign risk? And then number two, what is the sort of empirical evidence around this whole notion that, you know, Africa, there's some bias on the continent and we pay unnecessarily higher premiums than ought to be the case? And then the third sort of reflection point for me is the African Credit Ratings Agency the answer to all of this? And I would say straight away, it does and would play some role, but it is not the answer. And it comes back to the fundamentals in terms of, understanding how the market work. So sort of kind of straight away for me, when we're talking about sovereign credit ratings, we're measuring two fundamental things. One, which is measuring ability. So this is really the economic component of things, looking at revenue, your spending, your deficits, growth rates, all of those things, and I'll talk a bit more about that. And then the other aspect is the willingness, right? So you might have the resources, but are you in a position to actually, pay? What is the past history of default for the country? If you're like an Argentina, for example, then that would feature quite strongly in terms of, the premium that you would pay to get access into this the financing component. And so you've got a willingness component and an ability component, and both of this drive both the short and the medium term, financing decisions. And what then happens is that these two come together in a form of a sovereign credit rating, which is assigned by different companies. And basically, we want to measure the level of risk, which is associated to lending to a particular country or subnational entity, or even commercial companies for that matter. There are three big players within this space at a global level: Fitch, Moody's, and then Standards and Poor's. And they collectively more or less control probably about 95% of the market. So you can characterize it as some form of oligopoly. How they assign the ratings, and this is one of the big sticky points with a number of African countries. There is a solicited approach and then the unsolicited approach. So for the solicited approach, normally the governments or these entities pay a fee, you share some information with them, they go through the information and then basically come up with an assessment. And it's the unsolicited that became quite a bit problematic, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic, where a lot of these companies out of the blue downgraded a number of countries across the globe, certainly including in Africa. And this is what drove a lot of the concerns by many finance ministers of the sort of perceived bias that these ratings agencies have against Africa. It's also important really to note that this is not new. So in the aftermath of the 2008-2009 financial crisis, we've seen the rating agencies come under heavy criticism. And since that time, you actually have them much more tightly regulated than it ought to be even ordinarily during the case. So hence why I said, for example, at Standards and Poor's, on the side of the business that I work with, I cannot just wake up and talk to the credit ratings analyst. There's a number of Chinese walls and steps that one has got to go through to understand. Just to also say that there are other smaller players in this game, even on the African continent, and this is just a list of them. But fundamentally, what goes into the ratings assessment? A number of things. You're looking, like I said, we're measuring the ability and we're measuring the willingness component. And if you look at the slide on your left, the chart on your left-hand side, this is just basically looking at how the different or these three organizations rate, right? And what factors or indicators go into making the assessment from the economic or side of things, to your balances, to your monetary policy, down to other sort of structural or institutional factors. And then ultimately, it comes out in some sort of benchmark or number, right? So every country or company would sit or fall somewhere on this scale. Normally below BB plus or BA in the case of Moody's, it's classified as junk or sub investment grade. It doesn't mean that you wouldn't get money, but just means that you're going to pay a little bit more premium than it ought to be the case. And then these slides are just a few more details around what actually goes into the ratings assessment. So I'll just skip over them and just make the point that, look, the frequency of these ratings have actually increased over time. And if you look at the case of Africa, you actually, have a number of our countries sort of below that investment grade criteria line that I highlighted earlier. I think it's only Botswana currently that has an A- or A3 ratings. And basically what that means is that Botswana will pay a lower premium or a lower coupon on its debt as compared to, say, a country like Ghana, which is currently in selective default or restricted default if you use the, Fitch criteria. However, in the last few months, we've actually seen, off the back of the improving macro fundamentals, a number of our countries having gotten ratings upgrades. So I can certainly, talk about the likes of Morocco and Benin and Egypt and Togo and others, where basically we've seen them getting an upgrade of the back of improving macro fundamentals, improving structural reforms, and then improving sort of commodity, outlook for a number of these countries. On average, most of our countries are paying sort of between maybe 6 and about 10% in terms of the interest or the coupon rate. And the question that I recall the finance minister of Ghana make was, why should Ghana be paying, let's say, 7 or 8% when a country like Argentina, that's been a serial defaulter, pay a similar amount or say, other jurisdictions? And I'll come into some of those details in a moment. But fundamentally, the issue has always been that whenever we're downgraded, the cost of capital goes up for our countries. And this perceived bias has played strongly in the narrative. However, when you actually look at the empirical evidence on this, it's actually quite mixed. There's a number of things that one needs to actually take into account to really prove this so-called bias. And I have not seen as many papers that attempt to do this, with different econometric methodologies conclusively, for me personally, convinced me that there's some sort of bias, right, in this. And the more interesting one was this report that was issued by the United Nations just last December. And it was like a review paper of the global evidence, including in Africa. And what it was very interesting is that when you take into account, let me read it. It says, quote, however, systemic and consistent rating bias can be hard to prove and may be overshadowed by other forms of bias that are innate to the global financial system, itself. And ratings also assume less importance when countries adopt high quality and transparent data and debt management systems and establish accountable and effective institutions. And in my latter part of this conversation, it goes back to this: to what extent would the Africa Credit Ratings Agency really fundamentally address these issues here? Because it comes down to the credibility of the budgets that many of our countries, are presenting, and you realize that again there are big question marks on that. There's this other very useful paper that was done about a year and a half ago by the IMF economists there, and this is specific to Africa, and they took data going all the way from 1990 to 2022, and then did different econometric techniques and all of that. And so yes, okay, there's a premium, but when you actually do further adjustments, they say that the results show that the excess premium estimated for sub-Saharan African countries vanishes when these structural factors are accounted for in the regressions. In other words, when you take into account the credibility of the budget, when you take into account some of these persistent balances, the idea of the bias or the excess premium doesn't even exist, right, at all. And I think it's important that we take that into account. Then there's this other UNDP paper that was also done around the same time with some sort of estimation as well, and they say that the Africa-based ratings agencies have this oligopolistic structure, and their estimates show new patterns in credit rating idiosyncrasies, blah, blah, blah. And they say that this is due to the, quote, underrating of sovereign debt of selected African countries. So quite a mixed evidence base. But by and large, it tilts towards the dimension that the perceived bias vanishes or does not feature as much when one takes into account, other structural features in the budget. Again, Reuters commissioned an interesting study. This is from last year, and again they said they did not find any evidence of systematic, bias in that matter. And this is a big debate within the policy conversation or policy circles that is kind of ongoing. I had a case study of Ghana just to talk about this point, but for the purposes of time, I would skip on a few and then just go to the, is the Africa Credit Ratings Agency the answer? But, you had Ghana, classic example, was doing well, discovered oil, and they started, even spending the money, the revenues, before even a dollar had hit into the official coffers. And this table here just shows you almost on a yearly basis, they were going to the international capital markets to raise, right, Eurobonds. And in one particular one of them, the last one before the market shut the country out, they even held a party at the forecourt of the Ministry of Finance to celebrate what they called the hat trick. That is, they had raised a successful Eurobond, they had completed an IMF program, and the currency was also appreciating in value. And only just a year down the line, all of this, came back unraveling with a huge crisis that caused the country to go back to the IMF again for, another program. And during that, the country was downgraded, and the finance ministry challenged the downgrade by Moody's. And at the time, the finance minister said, quote, that they believed that the fiscal consolidation measures that they had put in as per the 2022 budget, right, anchored on debt sustainability and a positive primary balance, should address the concerns that Moody's had raised. Fact check, when the actual numbers came out for 22 and 23, most of the indicators that the government had actually said they would meet in the 22 budget was not met. And you then begin to sort of, ask yourself, how do you square that circle? So here you are taking on the agency and claiming that, well, your numbers were actually going to be better. But when the numbers actually came out only a few weeks down the line, they were all, in the red, and this became a big issue going forward. One other small point, and then I'll talk about the African Credit Ratings Agency, and it goes to the structural factors that I talked about. This is an example of Chile and Ghana, both of them commodity exporting countries, and you're tracking the year-on-year change in government expenditure versus the year-on-year change in revenue. And you can see in the case of Chile, even during the financial crisis when revenue dipped, they've largely maintained a consistent expenditure profile, right? If you look at Ghana and several of our other African countries, it's all over the place, right? So when revenue goes up, sometimes expenditure goes up, and revenue goes down, expenditure goes down, and the whole fiscal policy environment is just, weird, or to be more, technical. We're running these pro-cyclical fiscal policies rather than running a counter-cyclical fiscal policy, and this goes to the heart of a number of the things. Okay, so is the African Credit Rating Agency the answer? I think that it does offer an important step in terms of the geopolitics and the optics in having an African position on some of these issues around ratings. They claim that they're going to provide, quote, independent, credible, and an African-owned credit ratings agency, and this will be both for sovereigns, for subnational entities, as well as even do some, corporate ratings as well. And the objective is to enhance transparency, but also reduce the reliance on these three big ratings agencies. So far, they've got some support from the likes of the African Development Bank, DBSA, AfriExim Bank, and others to sort of push and drive this. And we're expecting it to actually be started proper middle part of this year, going forward. And this was all in relation to this so-called, perceived bias, which then means that African countries are paying more to access the capital, market. But the fundamental point, like I said, if you actually spend time to look at how the three ratings agencies do their work, and the methodologies, by the way, actually they're public. You can download the PDFs of the methodology and what goes into it. I begin to sort of wonder, though, how different the African Credit Ratings Agency, would be. What other indicators would they use that already are not captured as part of the, macro story or even micro story that would, improve the ratings outcome that they said? Because they said that they're going to incorporate what they call region-specific data, as well as other socioeconomic indicators. And it remains to be seen what these additional indicators, would be. Because even for the existing three agencies, the big three, now there's an increasing focus also on ESG issues within the ratings assessment that they do. This was not the case a few years ago, but the methodology keeps actually changing and keep tweaking. I think that...
Excuse me, I just wanted to say you've used 15 minutes, so please, if we could, another 5 minutes.
I'm almost wrapping up, all right? So I think that like the African credit rating agencies says themselves. They say that they are not there to compete or to replace the big three. Because if you're going to go to the international capital markets, to borrow, the way the markets work, and as I've seen, often these big three would still be there, right? Anyway, maybe AfCRA would offer some alternative assessment that you can say, hey, hang on, by the way, I've got this other assessment that, probably means that I should be paying a couple of basis points lower coupon than ought to be the case. But I think for me, as a way of progressing things, should after AfCRA, be set up and started middle part of the year, I would actually recommend that they start the emphasis on the other African countries. So there are actually 6 of them that would, sorry, not 6, there are few countries, I get the number, that don't have any ratings assessment at all from the big three. And that could almost be like a template to try and test out, how their ratings would play out, and sort of what the market perception or reaction would be to the assessment that AfCRA, does. So they're going to do both sovereign ratings, but also they're actually going to do local ratings. And I think there's an opportunity here to deepen their work around some of the new financial instruments. So for example, like green bonds, right? Or these sustainability-linked bonds, that could actually be a niche area that AfCRA can play to actually get more financing to come through for our respective, countries. So just to sort of re-echo the points that I am making, I think, yes, there's been a few challenges with African governments engaging with the big three. There have been some concerns. I think it comes down to, for me, as a practitioner, as an academic, a bit of a misunderstanding as to how the market, work. That it's not only about the external, but the local context. And they talk to analysts on the ground, getting our governments and AfCRA providing some technical assistance to set up desks at our respective ministries of finance to help them, engage with the market is also one of the important things that can be done. So just to conclude, all of this, the evidence on the perceived bias of the big three is mixed. It's tilted a bit more towards the idea that when you do additional specifications in the regressions, the bias actually vanishes in the presence of structural factors. AfCRA is important. It will fill a niche or a gap in the market, but fundamentally, the sweetness of the pudding would come in the eating, right? So 2 things: its independence and the ability to actually offer credible assessments with other indicators that maybe hitherto have not been considered by the big three, and it becomes a trust issue going forward. And I think for them to start, they could do or provide a baseline assessment for those countries that don't have any ratings, right, at all by the big three. So the likes of South Sudan and Zimbabwe that used to, Guinea-Bissau, etc., could be a useful starting point for AfCRA to engage going forward. So those are really the points that I had to discuss, and I'm hoping we can open it up later and engage. Thank you all very much, and pleasure to be here once again.
Thank you very much to our speaker. Thank you very much. I see we now have 45 participants here. This is really amazing considering, we've been having webinars now since COVID, and people are getting a bit tired of webinars, but I think it shows you the interest in this topic and the kind of the IDS's ability to bring different people together. Thank you very much, Dr. Achiampong. It really gave me a lot of things to think about. I won't abuse my position as chair to start asking the questions before we have the discussants. May I please first invite Professor Peter Murillo, who is an associate professor in finance and economics. I recently read a very good paper by him written on long-term finance and the need to transform some of our development banks. So he really has a lot of experience in this area. And Prof, may I ask you to keep your comments to 5 minutes, please?
Thank you very much, my
Dr.
colleague
Achiampong, you can take down your, okay.
Yeah, thank you very much, my colleague Ladia. And thank you, Theo Achiampong. If I pronounce it wrong, forgive my Kenyan accent. Thank you for the interesting presentation. I really enjoyed it. I received it yesterday. So if I haven't come too much, you'll forgive me for that. But when we talk of credit rating agencies, what are we exactly talking about? In Kenya, we have the credit reference bureaus. So that if I want to borrow a loan, you want to borrow a loan. That is what will assess your viability before the banks. So if countries want to do sovereign borrowing, then the credit rating agencies come handy because countries cannot have collateral like we do for banks. So they really play a critical role in unlocking private credit. For the African countries, IMF recommends that the debt to GDP ratio should be not more than 60%. But you'll find that in the year 2013, sub-Saharan countries were doing at 30% of GDP. But what happens today? It's more than 60%. I did a study with my master's student, Lucas Aguirre, and we basically wanted to establish the debt threshold for Kenya, which we found to be 55% in the year 2021. And that is what has been adopted by the government. But are we at that 55%? Certainly not. Most African countries on average, we are doing debt to revenue ratio at 340%. Now, I take you to the credit rating agencies. I picked 3 countries. Zambia in 2011 was graded at B+, Ethiopia 2014 at B, Ghana 2003 at B+. Today they have all defaulted. Now, slide 39 of the presentation. We have very good statistics about Ghana, but which goes up to the year 2022. And I was curious to ask, is this the circumstances to date? In the year 2022 early, I was hired as a consultant by the National Treasury to come up with mitigation on how we can improve the Kenya sovereign credit rating. And we did some background work with officials in the Treasury. But when the new government came to power, that was the contract was cancelled. Now, Ghana, which is a very good case study exemplified here, is doing debt service to revenue at 100%. So everything that is collected by the Revenue Authority of Ghana basically goes towards debt servicing. And we know about the HIPIC initiative in the year, 30 years ago, in which 100 billion were written off. But since 2004, when the credit rating agencies decided that African countries can go borrow from the international capital market, we have borrowed 113.5 billion. Now, what are the problems? What are the problems with Ghana, as we see in the slides? Now, Ghana went to the international capital market during the commodity boom, when the GDP was growing at 11%. Now, come to 2014, there is a drop in oil and commodities. And therefore, Ghana and Nigeria, which had gone into heavy euro borrowing, had problems. In 2015, Nigeria went into recession, and Ghana was growing at 2% of GDP. If you borrow, in finance, we talk of capital structure, that corporations can finance the operations either through borrowing debt. Yeah. It's either through borrowing or liquid. It's the same for a country. It's the same concept for a country. It's good to borrow if the returns that you're getting from the borrowing enables you to pay back. But what do we see with African countries? Ghana, in the year 2018, infrastructure projects through a Eurobond, they were left unfinished. Ghana 2020 borrows $3 billion US for dams and other projects. Then COVID comes, and then the money is converted into quantitative easing. You know, with the quantitative easing, then you have inflation. How do you bring down inflation? Through the monetary policy. So you raise the interest rates. Mozambique, 2013, the audit by IMF says 500 million could not be accounted for. Nigeria, in the year 2011, borrowed to increase hydroelectric power from 5,200 megawatts to 40,000 megawatts by the year 2020, but only 12,500 has been done to date. So, but we have a good case with Rwanda. So Rwanda borrowed in the year 2013 400 million, had invested in the convention center, which brings returns to the government, the Rwanda area, and hydropower. And some years later, in 2021, took 620 million to refinance. I mean, we call it restructuring. So you can borrow cheaply to retire old debts, which was borrowed at a higher cost. Because of these problems, what do we observe? And why do countries borrow at different rates? The presenter has talked of Argentina. Macroeconomic fundamentals. Institutional.
I'll request you to start. It's already 6 minutes, so please, if you can, 2 more minutes, please.
Okay, 2 minutes, I'll be done. Anyway, I'll share much of what I have later, but only let me go straight to the Africa credit rating. And I say it's not a problem to Africa in terms of buyers, because you remember in the year 2011, Italy was downgraded by Standard & Poor's, and the president Silvio complained. We know the cases of Greece and Portugal and the Asia financial crisis, also buyers. So will the Africa credit rating agency work? Now, there are questions. And one of the questions will be financing. It's not cheap. I give the case of Europe, when they decided that these three agencies are biased towards America and they thought of coming with their own. The AfCRA in the year 2012, which was established in Germany at a cost of $400 million, and then with the ratings, they said it was biased towards Germany. French came up with the coffees, and then the same thing. So Africa, who will finance it? That's the first question. It is being propelled by Africa Union, but we know that Africa Union, 60% of the activities are financed by the EU. The Africa Import-Export Bank and the AFDB, they are issuers of securities. The issuers of securities, will they also be receiving the ratings from, if they are the ones that are financing this? The issuance rates. For the African rating to remain afloat, then it must be issuing beyond Africa And then the question that comes in, are investors keen? Regulatory handles, each country has its own security commission. The geopolitical issues, India started their own, it could not go fast. So they decided that they should finance one of their own company to go global. Then we have the data quality issues in Africa, the informal sector issues, governance on data. When I talk of governance on data, the UN recommends that we rebase our data every 5 years. But then what happened to Nigeria in the year 2014? Yeah, they had not rebased for 20 years. And when they rebased, they found Nigeria, the GDP was double. So is it not right to pick one of the African-based credit rating agencies and grow it so that it goes global? Radia, in the interest of time, we will share the rest. I'll share the rest so that I can give time to my fellow discussants. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. You've really given us room to think about. And I'd now like to call the second discussant, Mohammed Salat, who is a public financial management expert who works for the African Capacity Building Foundation. Mohammed, please. It's now 2:52. Again, maximum 5 to 7 minutes. So then we have those of you who are following the chats will see it's completely exploded. It shows you the interest in this area. So we want to leave a bit of time for the discussions, but yeah, I already feel we may not be able to fully discuss. So Mohammed,
thank you, Dr. Radha. And maybe to start with is an issue of what really necessitated African countries wanting to come up with the African Credit Rating Agency. And I'll share an example of the COVID-19 pandemic. Immediately, the pandemic was declared. One of the suggestions that most countries were making is to supply enough body bags to African countries because our healthcare systems may not be able to cope. And that was one of the discussions that was really prominent and most people had been discussing. But did that come to happen? Were our healthcare systems really overwhelmed as people had projected? And at some point, it was a case for people to investigate or try to establish why the COVID-19 pandemic impact on a human perspective, not the economic impact, was not to the level that was previously expected. And now this boils down to the perceptions that people have about Africa. And since, or over the last decade, we've seen increased access to financial markets by African countries, where more than 21 countries had issued a combined Eurobond of around 115 billion. And as more African countries were accessing the private markets, one of the key critical points of discussions that experts were asking had been on around the cost of borrowing to Africa and looking at, are these credit rating agencies fairer to us? And a report by the UNDP, I think in 2023, had seen that with fairer ratings, Africa could have saved approximately $75 billion US. That was almost equivalent to 80% of our infrastructural development. And it was comparing it to official overseas development assistance of around 30 billion. So ideally, why do African countries, or what has led to the perception that we may not be having fairer credit ratings? And looking into just some basic facts, around the yields on Eurobond in around 2021 in most African countries were above 5% at a time when the global borrowing rate, especially for advanced economies, were around or less than 1%. And in more than 40% of African countries, they were accessing resources at more than 8%. The case study of Argentina that had also been shared, where in 2017, Argentina issued an 100-year Eurobond in 2017 that was oversubscribed at 7% coupon rate. And Argentina has defaulted in over 9 occasions on its sovereign debts. But at the same time, Angola, that had last defaulted before 2022 during their civil war, they issued a shorter term bond, 30-year shorter term bond that was also at 9%. It was priced at 9%. And a 2023 study by IMF also highlighted that between 2023 and 2021, sub-Saharan African countries paid at least 66% higher coupon rates at issuance compared to peers from the same region. And this brings now on board, and the question that most people had asked, investors mostly because of the lack of concrete information or like the limited information on some of the sovereign countries that are seeking resources from these international markets, had mostly or like look at the sovereign credit ratings as a way of determining whether to invest or not to invest and making certain decisions. And based on that, how do the credit rating agencies rate African countries? In comparison, African countries were downgraded at least 62% of the cases since their first rating, looking at the global average of 31%. And on average, it takes an African country 7 years to reach the level of grading, like for it to improve. So on average, it takes you 7 years. And this means it's 7 years of increased borrowing costs. And now this had also now led to the African ministers of finance and the various experts and their criticism of the credit rating agencies, particularly the big three. And one being the scarce investments in understanding the context of the various countries they are rating. And as Professor Atiampong had shared, that only 2 of the big three credit rating agencies have offices in Africa, and all these offices are in South Africa, while one does not have base in Africa. So there's a criticism that the big three had rarely invested in understanding the markets they are rating, trying to understand the various dynamics beyond what is visible. Are there any other factors that maybe or can contribute to the various coping mechanisms that they have? And I remember one of the local rating agencies in Kenya, Augusto, if I'm not wrong, I think it's Augusto and Company. At the time when Moody's had downgraded Kenya in around July 2024 after the cancellation of the finance bill, they had issued, now looking at the various or previous historical trends and understanding the Kenyan economy, they gave a positive outlook. And it didn't take more than 6 months this January for Moody's to revise their rating agencies. So ideally, one of the major criticisms that African countries had was at the slight occurrence of an event, they are very quick to downgrade African countries. And when situations improve, it also takes them a longer time for them now to take that into consideration and figure that out. And classical case of recently, what happened in Kenya, the finance bill, in Nigeria in 2023, there were concerns on the ability of the new administration based on the revenue and debt trends. But then within 1 year and in December of the same year, taking into consideration now how well the country's coped, they improved also at the rating for Nigeria. So mostly they're very quick to downgrade African countries, delaying in terms of upgrading countries.
Mohammed,
And
2 more minutes, please.
2 more minutes. Let me
you've already done
now
7 minutes.
quickly. Yeah. Okay, let me quickly rush to the Africa Credit Rating Agency. And both Professor Muriu and Professor Atiampong have looked into and conceptualized the opportunities that exist for the African credit rating agencies, and specifically the role it can play to develop the local or domestic financial markets, including issuing ratings to some firms listed in the security exchanges in Africa and issuing these ratings, giving them an opportunity for investors to learn and understand the various actors within these different economies and whether they can invest within the security exchanges in African countries. But two critical things looking forward, other than the financing costs that Professor Muriu has shared, it's also the ability and the availability of the competent personnel. Currently, what the local credit rating or African credit rating agencies are grappling with is the poaching of their staff, the cost it takes for them to train. And by the time you've trained personnel, the big three poach, they poach, and it's like the brain drain in terms of the personnel that will work within these various systems. And finally, and the last question, Dr. Rada, before you come on board, I'll want to leave the participants with a question that I asked, and I think Dr. Achiampong had also asked it previously. If we use the current existing data, will the Africa credit rating agencies come to different conclusions? And do African countries have a role to play in terms of strengthening their domestic economies, including how they spend resources that they can attract from international financial markets? How well we spend the debt we incur in terms of spurring economic development will inform our ability to be able to, in the future, repay these debts and also strengthen our macroeconomic indicators, as well as leading to favorable ratings in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to our speaker and to both the discussants. I really think when I've seen I've copied all the questions in the chat. I can share them. I think it may be, instead of in the past, I often like read out each of the questions, but today we have too many. So there are a couple of questions mainly around the bias, which I think both Dr. Achiampong and Mohammed, I'd like your view. Whilst these papers show that there may not be as much as a bias as people think there is, how can we assess whether there is a bias? It seems, issues that you brought up, which may not come in the previous paper, that the amount of time it takes to downgrade is much quicker than the time it takes to upgrade. So I think if Dr. Achiampong, you could answer that question. There's also a question of the funding. That's in a few of the questions. And then the second is the credibility of AfCRA and who would actually ask for, if they started rating countries that are not rated by the big three, how will that actually make a difference? So if I can ask Dr. Achiampong to answer those three questions, and then I'll give a chance to the other two speakers to answer those three questions.
Yeah, thank you. Very, very interesting conversations. And these are some of the things that I've been having with my colleagues, even at the office down in London. And the bias conversation and the reference to that UNDP report that came out. Actually, I read the report, and if you look at the econometric sort of approach that they use, frankly, it wasn't good enough. You for one to make those claims, you actually want to be sure that you've actually done a thorough piece of analysis to get to those conclusions. And so far, all of the evidence that I have seen doing review the literature clearly indicates that it's hard to prove this, right? The point about the timing, about they're quick to downgrade and slow to upgrade, I think it's neither here nor there, and I'll explain that briefly, right? So during the pandemic, almost every country got a downgrade around that same time, right? The issue was that it was an unsolicited sort of offer, and that this was like an out of cycle downgrade. And the response that the ratings agencies made that, well, these are called like extraordinary events, or what the lawyers may say a force majeure, that necessitated a bit of a change during the normal out of cycle change. The solution to that, and what I've seen some of them do now, is you've got a clear timetable. So you know that at the end of the year and mid-year, you're going to get an assessment, right? Based on that, you either upgrade or even may decide to keep the same score, but with a positive, negative, or whatever outlook that one takes. So there's a potential solution to the issue of the timings. Now, I can speak certainly of what I know at what S&P does, that every 6 months, there's a clear process for doing the assessment, and also from that you get the scores as a result, right, of that. And then the issue of the credibility that you raised, particularly for the new ratings agency. And I think Mohammed made an important point. So would AfCRA come to a conclusion that is different from the big three based on the current set of like data and all of that? Probably not. Or if we, it won't be that drastically different. So how are they going to sort of come up with things that would be or maybe perhaps different? And then number two, who actually in the market trust them? If you're coming to London or New York or Singapore to raise, capital, I can tell you that the people that are, say he who pays the piper, right, calls the tune, to be very blunt, right? They're going to still make reference to the reports done by these three agencies. So the solution to that, and what I've seen some treasuries do, is to the question that was made about personnel. Make sure that you actually have competent people that have worked within the market, speak the language of the market, sitting at your treasury and interfacing with, right, the three agencies, or even helping you on the road shows and all of that. And believe you me, you can actually shave a couple of basis points of even the interest or the coupon, just because you've got a caliber of personnel that these people can even engage or speak to. And sometimes it may be that, yeah, they sat in the same school, they went to the same university, right? Or in the same club. These little things actually play quite a big role in terms of the sentiments and things, that accompany it. But fundamentally, the point remains, if you're borrowing, you come to me with a prospectus that says that I need $1 billion, I'm going to use $500 million of that to build a road. And then 2 years down the line, I come to you and I'm like, okay, so where's the road and all of that? And you actually don't see either a road or the quality of the road is subpar. Then you've got big issues about potential repayment and all of that. And all those things will be priced into the risk. And then my last quick point, and I would shut up, is also we need to make a distinction between the ratings agencies and the cost of capital. They're two separate things, right? The ratings agencies actually will give you a rating. The actual pricing of the cost of capital is down to the financial institutions. So you're going to borrow from different players within the market. Yes, the ratings would have an impact, but it is not the only factor that plays into account in determining that cost of capital. Oftentimes, I've had financiers, they actually will call me and they're like, hey, Theo, you're the Ghana analyst, right? We want to give money to the Ministry of water resources to do XYZ things. They've brought this prospectus. We've seen the ratings done by S&P or Fitch or whatever, right? What are your views, right? So they actually go beyond the ratings. They have their own internal credit risk assessment and all of that. That play a huge role in determining the cost of capital. And I think that's also quite an important point that we need to make, to make a clear distinction between the ratings and the ultimate cost of capital. Thank you.
Thank you very much. But just to add there, I think they're two separate issues, but they are linked. I was speaking to some bankers recently when Kenya was downgraded, and it was almost automatic. Banks who have lines of, so yes, the Eurobond issue is different for the cost of credit for government, but banks in Kenya who have lines of credit from, say, DFIs or others, as soon as Kenya was downgraded, it's in the agreements, their cost of credit went up. So it's like nothing had changed, their balance sheet hadn't changed, but straight away the cost of the borrowing, that long-term line of credit, had gone up. So these things are interlinked. I can just ask Prof, who discussed, Prof, I found your comments, and a few other people have asked these questions. I found your comments on, this historical view that Germany had tried to start its own, and failed. India had started. I didn't know this, so it's really interesting hearing that. But in your views, if we want to have some sort of one of the other questions in the chat is trying to balance optimism and reality. If we want to take a bit more optimistic view of the role of the AfCRA from this experience of other credit ratings that have, funding is one issue. Salat has explained how, just the HR is such a big issue. That's such an interesting factor I hadn't thought of. But are there any key lessons that we can learn? And in terms of data points, is there any data that we feel that these there's a lot of questions on that these credit rating agencies are not using about Africa? I feel, for example, they probably penalize if the informal sector is big, whereas I don't think that should be a penalty. Are there any lessons we can draw from these examples of failed attempts to have another credit rating agency, Prof? And Mohammed,
Yes.
you could reflect on that as well.
Let me start with the data issue. Top scholars who are published in reputable journals, they have replicated the models that the three top rating agencies have used, and have arrived at the same conclusions. So it's really not an issue of, I don't see much of bias in it. What I see is, and the question that African leaders are not answering is, you want to walk into your bank today, a commercial bank here in town, and you want to borrow, and you are already on what we call the debt overhang. So when these rating agencies come to correct data to fit in their models, most of the data, particularly on institutional indicators, is not available. I'm currently doing some work for African Development Bank. We started in September preparing the African Economic Outlook for 2025. And the theme for this year is the institutional indicators. And these institutional indicators have to do with corruption, have to do with the regulatory quality, have to do with government effectiveness, have to do basically what we call the institutional environment. This data for most of the countries is not available. So, so when you factor in the model and you don't have accurate and reliable data, then what happens? If you go to the website of Kenya Bank Association, you'll find the loan pricing models for the banks. And suppose there is no data. So the case of, so data here is a key issue. Is a key issue when it comes to the rating agencies. African leaders are operating below, we are quite a number of countries, we are beyond 100% debt to revenue. That what KRA is correcting in Kenya, 100% goes to debt. And then we go to borrow, and we are denied. We cannot go to the Eurobond market and the international capital market And then we say, no, rating agencies are biased. I've given an example of Italy. They could not borrow, and so they said it was biased. So the case of Germany and the case of France, because since the rating agencies are based in US, they believed that they were biased towards Europe. But when you look at Fitch, Fitch is based in New York and also in London. But who are the owners? Is the French. The Fitch is owned by the French. So Germany came up with theirs, started doing the ratings. I've even quoted the year. And then they said that these other countries said that it's biased towards Germany. So France started theirs because France believes that which is good for Germany.
Hey, Prof, what I'm trying to, and this is linked to some of the questions of, how, like the question is, how can the Africa Credit Agency strike a balance between promoting investment? So we see, like, is there any lesson we can learn that we agree that the AfCRA will probably not replace the big three, but if it's supposed to provide some sort of complementary role or some sort of balancing role, what lesson do you think would be a key thing for the African Union to pay attention to?
Okay, once the Africa Credit Rating is established and it picks up, it can only play a complementary role. Because why will they be sourcing data that these other rating agencies don't source? It's the same. But there is a problem in terms of regulation and ownership. If you look at all the credit rating agencies, they are not owned by regions, continents. They have to be private players to gain trust, because trust is a major issue. Okay, you want to go float a Eurobond to the pensioners globally. And they hear, okay, it's Africans borrowing. How I'm the investor? Do I believe the rating from their own African body? So those are the trust issues that will emerge. Thank you.
Ahmed, if you had to, I really like this question of like trying to be a bit more optimistic. Or what do you feel that if you had something to say in terms of trying to make AfCRA, like having this balance between optimism and realism? Realistically, it's not going to replace, but if it can provide some sort of counterbalance, what do you think would be the key things needed to have that counterbalance?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Raya. Ideally, it's not only rating of sovereignty to enable African countries to access the international markets. There's a lot of opportunities in terms of even the development of local financial sectors. And if I clearly remember in a meeting of the Africa Peer Review Mechanisms expert in Cairo, one of the governance features was that it should be an Africa private sector owned, particularly even with the various security exchanges from Africa playing a very key role, including issuing ratings to African-based institutions in terms of opening up the markets for the global investors to understand and issue a verifiable rating with the procedures that have been undertaken, and issuing ratings to local institutions and enabling them to be able to attract investment. So that's where a unique opportunity currently exists, because most of the big three are not focusing on that. And starting with the countries, as Dr. Chiampong had said, the countries that do not have a rating, looking into the domestic financial markets in African economies and issuing ratings to enable now several people to understand and be able to evaluate and see where they can invest in.
There's a discussion about the funding. Do you feel that the African Union has the kind of, it's like, as Professor Kamau is pointing out, that if many countries are not paying their AU subscriptions already, what hope is there that this AfCRA will be fully funded?
So I remember one of the issues that was raised and that the AUC had encouraged was that it has to be delinked from the AUC itself in terms of funding and give the private sector players the opportunity to invest in the AfCRA, because that will also give the independence with respect to now how AUC institutions or African countries can influence the rating. And it was a call to private sector investors at that time to be able to invest in AfCRA. And for most of its funding provided by AfCRA. And I remember one of the key points that had come out is also the cost that it will cost, like the cost that it gets for you to get the solicited rating from the big three vis-a-vis the cost, or like how affordable it will be for African countries and African institutions to be able to engage with AfCRA for them to get the rating. And now based on that, that was seen as also one of the major potential revenue sources that could lead to the development of AfCRA. So the idea is that it's private sector-led initiative that is delinked from AUC institutions and countries to ensure that there is some level of independence in terms of the ratings they issue and its management. Thank you.
We have 8 minutes left. We do have a lot of questions in the chat. I also have a question on one of the slides that Dr. Acheampong, you put, where you showed that with the 3 credit rating agencies, you know, some use 16 indicators, 21. And then it showed that maybe Moody's is more qualitative. I wanted to just ask you a question on that what does that mean? Is there any study that shows, like, as someone who is in other research, who's a fan of like qualitative data, mixed methods data, is there any evidence to say that Moody's is maybe more context specific to the when they take into account the questions? And then the other is this broader question which you raised about, you know, the forming of the proposal, the prospectus. Like, what is the process that countries go through to develop a prospectus that they then put in, you know, to international banks and international markets? It's a question that I just find so interesting. I hadn't thought of that you know, Kenya, like I've seen many times when, you know, when there's a company that wants to list on the Nairobi Stock Exchange, or they'll form a prospectus, but I hadn't thought that there's actually a prospectus that Kenya develops for its Eurobond. The other question is the interlinkages. So when Ghana defaults, or Zambia defaults, or Ethiopia defaults, what is the impact on other African countries' ratings? Yeah, so if you have any, and you know, I can see I'm sure you can see all the questions on the chat. If Dr. Acheampong, you can pick those 3 questions, any other one you have from the chat? Yeah,
absolutely. I'll be very quick about this. And let's start from the bottom, and it's a real concern, the so-called domino effect, right? That you see a series of countries defaulting, and then suddenly, you know, 2 or 3 countries become like the proxy for all of 54 countries on the continent, and that's a concern. But also, you also sometimes see a bit of a market correction, right, as well. So if you actually look at the daily CDS spread data, and you correlated that to like the announcement and on these timings, yes, so initially you see a bit of a spike, you know, concerns and all of that, but then you actually do also see a correction subsequently, you know, down the line. And often it comes down to the big spikes are not around regional events, but specific country events where, you know, maybe they read the budget, or let's say in the Kenya with the finance bill, and there are like big concerns about, hey, how are you going to, you know, close the deficit and things like that. So I think, yes, there are issues with the domino effect, but it's not really borne out fully by at least the data I've seen. I've not run any empirical models, so it's with a bit of a caveat. Take it with some salt. With Moody's, and I think I put this on the screen. That's where a lot of the concern has really come from, right? So in Ghana's case, the issue they took on was with Moody's, that, well, they were like, they preempted the government and did a downgrade when they were not called for. The other two took a bit of time before eventually making the assessment. And I recall a conversation with a chap that was like, okay, maybe it's because they're American, you know, they're being fast to do that. But you do see, if you look at the Moody's methodology, if you actually downloaded it, it's a bit more qualitative in some dimensions than you would, for example, with Fitch and S&P. I think they're also tweaking, and so with time, you know. But the point is that when you even look at the assessments that they make, ultimately these three all converge around the same thing. So on the scale, you will see that a country would be in the same scale, but the outlook may be different. So one may be positive, negative, or stable, or something around that. And what I personally am interested in is actually seeing, okay, so if AfCRA does get set up eventually, you know, what criteria would they be using? Prof made a point about like the size of the informal economy, right? And that is punished rather than, and for me then becomes, okay, can we find other indicators? Are these informal guys contributing more, you know, to the tax, you know, bracket? Do we see, let's say, productivity enhancements, right? So is there a benchmark for productivity that you can include in the model as an indicator of like the long-term prospects of the country beyond just GDP growth rate and, you know, per capita growth rate and things like that. Same thing with the debt metrics, you know. So everybody is talking debt to GDP, but there's more to that. Debt to exports, debt to revenue. You know, there's even talk now about using gross national GNI and other indicators in this, you know, assessment. So it's just really what different would AfCRA do on the methodological side, on the data side, that these three aren't already doing. And maybe, you know, we can have this chat again in a year's time and bring them in here and say, okay, guys, what have you actually done around that? And then quickly on the prospectus and the process, it's actually quite a complicated and a lengthy one. So normally what happens is this: the sovereign would engage with the local financial institutions. So there may be like a local investment bank or finance house. They would be the local broker. And then there would also be a bunch of foreign brokers that would help them do the roadshow and the marketing, and eventually, you know, the offers, you know, come in. And these brokers are actually paid a fee. It's not for free. And then they help put together the prospectus, and these can be quite big documents. Some of them well in over 100, you know, pages of length. I think the other quick issue often, and this is the criticism having also played in the market and watched these things in the City of London, is that sometimes the finance people or the lenders don't really care, right? So long as they are going to get a return on that investment, or the coupons will be paid, then it doesn't really matter whether the fiscal policy of the government is credible. And this is also because, you see, for most of the loans, they actually buy an insurance on it. So you've got a political risk insurance on these loans, hedging them against the likelihood of default. So it's more like somebody's, you know, kind of worms to deal with. And then when things even when push gets to shove, and you have to do a debt restructuring, and they have to take a haircut and all of that, you know, if you look at it again from a portfolio point of view, okay, so Ghana raised maybe 2 billion, but it's probably
I'm
just
sorry,
100.
Dr. Champa.
Sorry, yeah,
Yeah.
just 100
I think
million
I'll have to,
of the
yeah,
total portfolio. And so, yeah,
yeah,
it becomes, they can get away with it sometimes.
yeah. But this links very nicely, and I'll just, sorry, we're out of time now. Thank you everyone who attended and everyone for your questions. I can, it's been so interesting. And as Professor Mitula said, we really kind of have learned a lot of some of the nuts and bolts. But again, as Professor Mir said, our debt to GDP ratio in many African countries is very high. So I might just end with a comment by one of our colleagues, Mwali Mujoka, who says that actually, the main question now is actually how can we, rather than the specifics of debt rating, is it actually possible for us to, move away from borrowing and, harness, like kind of move, because we'll always be in this kind of unequal hierarchy. So how we can move away from that. And that's a very broad question, but it's like we've gone from something very specific to very broad. But I'll thank you all for a really, really interesting discussion. Thank you to Basil and the team for all the support and the admin support, and to Professor Kamau and Professor Mitula for bringing together this exceptionally interesting presentation. Thank you all, and stay in touch. We'll be informing you of our next seminar through all our social media channels. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon.